Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the 19th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. I am Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, and I have to say, I'm here to kick off things on our main stage where we showcase some of the biggest authors of the world. And as a librarian and a book lover and a reader and a film watcher, this is heaven. I want to watch everyone watching online or say hello and welcome. And we will be live streaming authors here on the main stage coast to coast. So whether you're waking up in California or watching us from your breakfast table in Atlanta, greetings from Washington, D.C. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the more than 1,000 volunteers helping today. Many of them started at 6 a.m. And for the past year, the library has been celebrating America's changemakers. We currently have an exhibition devoted to the 100th anniversary of the suffrage movement, and in December, we will recognize the change-making civil rights icon, Mrs. Rosa Parks, with a new exhibition. I think of writers and books as important drivers of change. Books can change society, they can start a movement, and they can transform lives. I know they certainly have done that for me. We also want you to know that the Library of Congress is a library for everyone. There are more than 170 million unique items, including items from the change makers you know: American presidents, Frederick Douglass, Thomas Edison, Margaret Mead, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Martha Graham and Alvin Ailey, Antonio Stradivarius, we have 6 Stradivarius violins, and Billie Holiday. Now, I could go on and on because we're talking about more than just books, but manuscripts, maps, prints, photographs, movies, recorded sound, films, and even the world's largest collection of comic books. So I invite all of you to visit your library, the Library of Congress, and use the collection wherever you are, in person, online, at loc.gov. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to the change maker we are honoring today. But before I do, I want to acknowledge the recent passing of one of the world's greatest writers, Ms. Toni Morrison. You may know that she was a past recipient of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction and a towering figure and voice in the literary world. Her stories were a source of hope and inspiration for so many, and her words will live on long after her passing. Our newest recipient of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction is Mr. Richard Ford. He is the author of Independence Day, the first novel to win both the Pulitzer Prize and the Faulkner Award. He is one of America's premier writers whose work is profoundly human, meticulous in the craft. And I had an opportunity to select him for this year's prize based on nominations from more than 60 distinguished literary figures, including former winners of the prize, acclaimed authors, and literary critics from around the world. One of the Library of Congress's most prestigious awards, and now in its 10th year, the Annual Prize for American Fiction honors an American literary writer whose body of work is distinguished not only for its mastery of the art, but also for its originality and imagination. The award seeks to commend strong, unique, enduring voices that throughout long and consistently accomplished careers have told us something essential about the American experience. Richard Ford has been called our Babe Ruth of novelists, and there is good reason why. He is quintessentially American, daring on the field, and he consistently hits it out of the park. We are proud to confer the library's Lifetime Award for Fiction on this luminous storyteller, one of the most eloquent writers of his generation. Please join me in congratulating Mr. Richard Ford.
They read today. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Hayden, and thanks to the people who voted this award to me. It's really barely imaginable to me. And my gratitude, too, to my darling who makes me being a writer and who makes everything else in our life possible, as well as exciting and unpredictable for 55 years. Probably nobody can win a prestigious award, I can't, without thinking a mistake's been made somewhere. I mean, you still accept, right? You just get out the door. I was signing books in Mississippi last week, and a man came up to me and asked me to sign a book about intergalactic space monsters. It was written by Richard Ford. It had some lurid green and yellow cover. I thought about telling him I was the wrong guy, but hell, I just signed it. But when this prize was announced last spring, a wonderful day in our life, a lady in New York who reads my books, one of the three of them, wrote me a note expressing congratulations. And I wrote her back because I always write people back. And I said to her that I felt I'd always been lavishly overpraised for the writing I'd done. She wrote back and said, well, not lavishly. Having this award, holding it, makes me think of my colleagues and their remarkable work, both those who've received this prize before and those who haven't but will, and also those who maybe never will, but should. Mistakes get made. Their writing sustains and heartens me. Writing stories is not a competitive sport. When someone does something excellent, we all have reason to feel emboldened, even if admittedly we may not at that precise moment feel the elation we'll feel later. But it's an excitement that our own efforts can occasionally make us feel, and is similar to the elation we feel when we find our book housed in some great library, such as the Library of Congress. And it's also a sensation readers feel, me included, since it signifies that we're all in this together. And these days, we all know, that is a feeling worth clinging to. I am clinging. I'm clinging to it right at this moment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. How's that? So wonderful to see you all out there. I'm Marie Arana, and I'm the literary director of this festival. It's always a joy to see people come out to see the writers they love, because they are the readers we love at the Library of Congress and as writers. I am really, really honored to be sitting here with Richard Ford, whom I have been reading, I think, at least since I was a little girl. Thank you. Not quite, but this is one truly, and we must know it and laud it, one of the great eloquent voices of contemporary American literature. And I loved when Dr. Hayden said, mastery of the art. We have it here. I know it makes you uncomfortable for me to talk about you this way, but and enduring art it needs to be as well to win this prize. And I think there will be nothing so enduring as the writing of Richard Ford, his wonderful Frank Bascombe, am I pronouncing it right, Bascombe? Novels, and you know them, The Lay of the Land, Independence Day, The Sportswriter, and my favorite, which is Canada, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But extraordinary career, so many prizes, so many novels, so many short stories. He's a master of the short story as well. So I want to start by asking you, Richard, in the most sort of, I know it's hard to imagine this as a living room with a fireside and all of this.
We're all in this together, I think.
Yeah, we are. You write very gritty, down-to-earth stories, and they're about ordinary people like Frank Bascombe, who is basically an everyman. He is an introspective everyman, and most of the books about Frank are about loss or about not having or about not being up to things. How did you come to Frank Bascombe?
Well, I had quit writing, actually, around 1981, because I had written 2 novels and nobody had read them. And so I thought, well, that's my shot. And I took a job, and the job that I took sort of fell out from under me, that went away. And so I went back, we were living in New Jersey, and I went back home from my job, and I said to Christina, I said, I think I'm gonna try to write a novel, one more crack. And she said, I have an idea. She said, why don't you write about someone who's happy? She said, you've never really done that before. And so, you know, faithful to the old Tolstoy directive that happy families are all alike, which happens, by the way, not to be true at all. Happy families are no more alike than unhappy families. I thought, how would I go about writing a character who was happy and make it interesting? Because it's a line of Wallace Stevens. Stevens says, we gulp down evil, choke it good. So I thought, how can I write about good in a way that doesn't cause people to choke? So I thought, well, I'll write about somebody who has sustained a loss and who is trying to make himself whole again. So fundamentally, it was devising a kind of perfectly human situation in which bad has befallen someone and good is the goal. And so that in a sort of intellectual way is how that came about. And the voice that Frank uses, or that I use for him, he doesn't have a voice, I make him do everything, is a kind of an amalgam of things that I had done. You know, we were talking last night about reading. We all were talking about reading. I had read a lot of books which made me think that the most important thing that a book could do was to be both grave and comic at the same time. And so I wanted Frank to be able to be serious and be grave, but also to be human and humorous at the same time. So it came from that. And there were books that I read. I read Walker Percy's wonderful novel, The Moviegoer. I read Joe Heller's wonderful novel, Something Happened. I read Fred Exley's wonderful novel, Fan's Notes. Yeah. So those books all sort of funneled in to contribute to me some apparatus for how to do those things.
What did you like about those? I'm really interested in that. Fred Exley, I mean, these are all authors who are not well known enough, don't you think?
Yes, particularly Walker, and Joe. You know, we all know Joe because of Catch-22, but really, in most ways, in my view, Something Happened is a much superior book.
Absolutely.
But when it was, there was 25 or so years he was writing it, and then it came out, and those of us who knew him and knew his work loved it, but it kind of fizzled. And Exley's book is a total one-of-a-kind book, and so it deserves great attention.
This is Fred Exley, and the book is a fan's notes.
Fan's notes.
And not enough people know about it.
No, they
It's
don't.
Extraordinary American work.
And if I told you what it was about, you wouldn't want to read it. But like all books, you have to read them.
Yeah.
So those books were first-person narrations with present tense verbs. And for a writer, that means everything, rather than, say, Updike's books, which are past tense narrations with third-person narrative modes. So for me, that's what I learned from those books, how to make the present. There's a line of Wittgenstein which says, "He who lives in the present lives in eternity." I wanted to create the illusion that this is happening now and it is everlasting.
Those authors are particularly interesting to me in response to your saying that they inspired you.
Yes.
This is Joe Heller, Walker Percy, and Fred Exley, because they basically capture things that are small, the small, ordinary, quotidian things of life, but there's something very resonant and large about the overall result when you finish the book. I mean, you feel filled with something large.
Right.
Is this your intent? Because
Yes.
you do that every time.
Well, if you think that, there's a definition of what a political novel is, and I think all of my books are political novels in one particular way. And this is the largeness I hope that I would aspire to, and that those books certainly attain. A political novel is one in which history is working on individuals in the sort of privacy and sanctity of their lives. But history is always there, and with X or with Joe, history is always something you're aware of. Without the books necessarily pointing upward to the larger picture, we're always pointing rather inward to the smaller picture. But that's life-affirming, as we were saying last night. If you can argue through the agency of a book that life is worth paying your closest attention to, not only will you maybe screw up fewer times, but you will affirm life by living it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, that's why your books will endure, Richard. And this is very big. You're from Mississippi.
Mm.
You're from the South. But your books cover the whole country and, outside with your book on Canada. What is it about Mississippi that produces so many extraordinary writers?
Well, it's not the water. Water's all muddy. I've thought about this for 1,000 years. As I said, as we were talking last night, the South has so much to account for, particularly slavery and racism and inequality and poverty of the least of us. And that's insoluble as a dilemma in a country as rich as ours. So we who are Southerners, blacks, whites, all of us, ultimately probably always going to be dealing with that as part of our background and trying in some ways to make the insoluble, at least upon the page, be soluble. Provisionally, only for the span of the book. We can't solve it. We can't erase it, but we can address it. And if we can address it, we can live a little longer. So I think it's that. I mean, that may seem like a facile explanation, but it is a load-bearing explanation because it takes on what we all have to take on, which is the responsibilities of history, just as Faulkner did.
Indeed. You grew up across the street from Eudora Welty.
I did.
Pretty amazing, right? I mean, did you look in her window? Did you knock on the door?
No, hers was a big house. Ours was a little one. No, the Weltys were in Jackson terms quite well. They weren't rich. Her father was a vice president of an insurance company. they were well-to-do in a large family. All of them came from Ohio and West Virginia to Mississippi, and my family was a tiny little family, and my father was a traveling salesman, and we weren't in the same social set.
Well, the interesting thing for me about Eudora Welty is that she went to bed at night, got up in the morning, went across the room, sat down at her writing desk. She did everything in her bedroom.
Right in her bedroom. You can't, whenever you see that famous picture of her looking out the window,
right.
She's in her bedroom,
She's in
at her
bed.
desk.
Right.
Right.
Didn't get out in the world too much, but she knew a lot about the human spirit.
She got out a little more than would seem. You know, she went to the University of Wisconsin, for goodness sakes.
Right.
and she traveled to Europe as much as she could. She, you know, even though her family was well-to-do, she had her mother many years on into her life, and her mother was not well for much of that time, the 50s and 60s. So she didn't go abroad or far away as much as she would have liked to. But she was a great friend of Elizabeth Bowen, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so she went to Ireland. She went to Bowen's court. She went as much as she could. But by and large, she had this coterie of friends in Jackson, which just filled up her life. And they got together all the time. Eudora was a great wit and hugely amused by life. Christina and I used to drive around with her in Mississippi, and she would just sit there and point out things, and she would say, I wonder what that squirrel is thinking right now. Then she'd say whatever the squirrel was thinking.
That's pretty wonderful. Well, you say your father was a traveling salesman. He sold starch?
Laundry starch.
Laundry starch.
When it used to come in little powdery boxes.
Right. And your life story is so interesting because your mother...
I've never thought that.
Oh, my goodness.
That's the first time I ever thought that was true.
It needs to be said, his most recent book, he has a book coming out next year, in 2020, of short stories, but your most recent book is a memoir of your parents' lives.
Yes. And
how your life fitted into that. And it's really an extraordinary book because it's an extraordinary American life. There is this sense of family looseness, a kind of moving from one place to another, being given to your grandfather to raise once your father died. Your mother having been the child of a woman who had her when she was 14 years old. And it's just an extraordinary sort of life, and you realize as you're reading this book, so that's what it takes to make a writer.
They'd be very shocked to hear you say that.
There's an extraordinary passage in this book. It's called Between Them. And it was written in two parts, right, Richard? It was written once, was long ago.
Right.
And then the part about your mother.
Mother first, father second.
Father second. And your father died when you were a young man, well, you were just a boy. 16 years old. And the scene that you describe in your memoir is so moving. I want to ask you to read it to the group here. Please read the scene of Richard at age 16 and his father's death.
Yeah, okay, it's important to say that. This is the scene in which my father dies. Nothing out of the ordinary. I watched Rawhide on TV. They went into her bedroom and closed the door. At some point later, he went to bed, and then I watched television until midnight, and then I went to sleep. At 6, I was awakened by my mother saying my father's name, Carol, which is what she called him. Wake up, Carol, wake up. What's the matter? Wake up. Then loudly, wake up. I got out of bed in my pajamas, went into the hall to the door of the next room, which was his. My mother was leaning forward beside his bed over him. My father was gasping for air in his bed. His eyes were closed. He wasn't moving except for the gasps. If you looked, his skin did gray. Wake up, my mother said insistently, but different from that. Carol, wake up. She held his shoulders put her face close to his and shook him, but he did not move. "Richard, what's wrong with him?" she said. She looked around at me. She was about to cry and was becoming panicked. She was on the verge of something bad. It was February 20, 1960, 4 days after my birthday. I don't know if I said "I don't know" to her question, but I came forward, got up onto the bed where he was, and took both my father's shoulders in my hands and shook him very hard. Not as hard as I could, but hard. I said his name, Daddy, several times. He took a deep breath in and let it out strenuously in a way that made his lips flutter as if he was trying to breathe, though I think he was dead. With my two hands, I turned his face upward, used my thumbs to pry loose his fleshy mouth and teeth, and I put my own mouth over his and breathed down into him, into his mouth and throat, as I imagined into his chest. I didn't know how to do this or if it made sense. I'd only heard about people doing it, but I did it several times, possibly 10. And the result of my efforts to breathe for him or to bring my breath to him and wake him up and be alive was nothing. He did not breathe again or utter another word. After some time on my knees, on his bed with him, when I must have begun to conceive the thought that he was dead, I got down and turned to my mother, who had by then backed into the open doorway and put her fists to her temples, watching all that was going on in front of her. I don't know that I said anything to her. I may have stifled some sound deep in myself, but as my mother said, "Oh no, oh no, 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 no," which is when I went past her as she was saying this and down the hallway to call the doctor. His house was not far from ours. Such things, the doctor coming, were more usual then than they are today.
Extraordinary passage. It must be very difficult to read. I'm sorry I made you read it, but it gets into our souls, I think, to hear that particular story. How?
But I wrote it, okay?
Yeah.
So I wrote it so I could read it.
Yes.
And I wrote it so somebody else could read it. When you write a passage like that, it is not so much to absolve yourself or free yourself, but it is to make use of something that happened to you for the benefit of someone else. So it's sometimes hard to read that, but I wrote it.
You sure did. So for the benefit of someone else, the writing of a life, to what degree would you say that when you're writing about Frank Bascombe or you're writing in short stories or Carla, to what extent do you actually harvest your lifetime experiences, Richard?
As little as possible on the page. I think if I'm ever writing a novel and I find myself writing about myself, I think I'm not doing things as well as I should be doing it. I think that things that are made up, that are confected out of the accumulation of life, which is written down, not about my life, but of my life, then I'm doing the best I can do. I mean, I think that the whole, for me anyway, it may not be true for my colleagues, for other writers, but the made-up thing is better than the reported on life thing. I just think for me, it's more freeing. Life is reported is harder to change. Novels need to be, along the way of writing them, changed and evolving so that you can actually say things which you didn't know you could say. So it's easier for me to do that if I'm working on material that I make up. Yeah. But underlying it, I mean, there's still always RF there at the desk.
Right.
So some of that, some things of mine filter into Frank. We're both Democrats. Whatever that used to mean. And we both have some of the same incorrect attitudes toward things. Having children, for instance. He has children, I don't. So it's a lot easier for me to write about him having children without myself, Christina and me, having had any children. So little bits underlying everything. I authorize everything, so that's what it means to be an author. You authorize everything. So whatever I authorize, even if I don't believe it, I want you to have it. So
I want you to watch your clocks, your watches, your cell phones. At 10:45, I'm going to ask you to, or take a place at the microphone if you want to ask a question of Richard, which I'm sure you do. So sticking with your life, Richard, then at 16, was it at 16 that you went off to your grandfather's?
yes, in Little Rock. We lived in Jackson, Mississippi. Those of you who are familiar with that obscure part of the world, you know that Little Rock and Jackson are 4.5 hours apart.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and very different life there because your grandfather owned a big hotel.
Well, he ran it. Somebody else owned it. Rich people owned it. We worked for them.
So, but you were sort of a young master of the house.
Yes, I was. I was the sort of dark Eloise. I was turned loose in a big 600-room hotel on a daily basis to fend for myself and find whatever amused me. And you talk about the gritty we talked about earlier. That's where the gritty is, in a big old bargee drummer's hotel in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a good place to learn stuff.
Famous people stayed there?
Yes, they did. Nelson Rockefeller, Harry Truman, Joe Louis came to the hotel, though it was the segregation days. He couldn't stay there. My grandfather, to add a little grainy bit of this, agreed to let Martin Luther King come and stay in the hotel, even though it was the segregation days in the 60s. And at some point, the powers that be in Little Rock inveighed against that, and he wouldn't let Martin Luther King stay in his hotel. It was that way. It was bad. It's not funny. It's not that you or I are laughing about it, but that's how it was there then.
Yeah.
I lived in that. I lived in that environment. And so,
Well, a good place to observe people, a hotel, people coming and going, attitudes, people meeting, strangers talking.
those are the nice parts.
Yeah.
My grandfather, who was a kind of a bon vivant, roué kind of a guy, quite wide in a way, quite lewd in all kinds of other ways. He thought it was important for me to see the world at ground level, and so sometimes in the middle of the night, a couple of times this happened, maybe 3, someone committed suicide in a room, and he woke me up and took me down there and made me go in the room with him. It was, I was when I was 16, 17, and this is not parenting advice. This is just what happened to me. And there was a lot of stuff like that, and sexier and worse, and it was not a union shop, but the unions were trying to take over a representation of the hotel employees, a great majority of whom were African Americans and low paid. And when they would have union meetings, they would be held about 2 o'clock in the morning, so everybody would be asleep, and it would be the night shift they were trying to organize first. And when word would come that the union was having a little meeting down in the basement of the hotel, my grandfather would put a pistol in his belt and go down there and break that meeting up and take me with him. So it was like that. I mean, it was the 1960s.
Growing up, yeah.
Growing up, yeah.
Were you a good boy, Richard, or were you a little bad?
I'm looking at my wife right now. I think I was a bad boy. I was a bad boy.
There's a reason I asked that question.
I broke into houses and stole cars and did a lot of that kind of stuff and got put in jail for fighting. And but all these things happened. We were just little suburban twerps. But all these things happened until my father died. And when my father died, my mother took me aside and she said, Richard, she said, if you get put in jail now, I can't get you out. She said, I have got to take a job. Your father's gone. I have to take care of us, just the two of us. And that got through. That got through. And I thought to myself, okay, that part of your life, stealing cars, breaking into houses, fighting went on a bit, that has to stop. And it stopped. And I don't know if I just internalized all of that stuff, that I was going on still being the bad boy I was, just not acting it out, or if actually I got better. I wanted to get better. I believed that I do believe it's possible, and as a writer, I've lived this directive for myself. I believe as writers, over the course of a 50-year life, such as I have had of writing, you have to get better. You start off and you're pretty good at something, and you get a little better at something else, but now I'm 75, I'm writing a novel, I have to get better at it. So that sense of betterment has always been part of the arc of my understanding of life. It's not quite a progressive view of history, but it sort of has an internal progressive view.
Indeed. Well, I think Christina would say you're a good boy.
Will you say? She just said all girls like bad boys.
So I want to talk about my favorite book, which is Canada, which was a departure for you.
Yes.
Now, Canada is an interesting subject because you think they talk like you, they look like you, they are practically you, but they're not.
Profoundly different. Profoundly different.
What made you choose to put your...
What made me choose was, as is the case in the origins of any novel, a whole bunch of things. Principally it was, we were living in a little wheat prairie town called Dutton, Montana, and I was trying to write a story about a kid, an American kid, who, I just got it in my brain, an American kid who, for some reason, crosses the border into Canada, goes from Montana to Canada, which isn't very far, and as you say, you cross the border there on the 49th parallel. It doesn't look very different. Most of the people are white people, like these people, though if you get a little farther away, you find native people and Métis. They're not all white people. And so that was the sort of igniting piece of material, and I had to think then, well, why would a 15-year-old boy cross by himself from the United States into Canada? And I thought, well, what would have happened to him that would have necessitated this? And so the novel kind of backloaded itself in that way. I thought, well, what can I have happen to him? I thought, well, I could make his parents rob a bank. And so I thought, well, okay, if being the bad boy that I was, I thought writing about robbing a bank would be really cool. So it went like that. And it was, and I had been in Canada a lot for books and for Ray Carver and I used to go goose shooting in Canada. I'd been across that border many times, and you don't go across that border into southern Saskatchewan, at least I never have, without this feeling of immensity and this feeling of, as we said before, of difference. And I wanted to try to give an utterance to what, and I can't probably paraphrase it, to give an utterance to what that difference is. What is it that makes Canada, well, for so many Americans, a refuge? And for my character, it was a refuge for him, though a very complicated refuge.
And of course, in your generation, there were people who were literally fleeing to Canada.
Absolutely.
To avoid the Vietnam War.
I mean, many of the early white settlers of southern Saskatchewan were Americans coming up from below the border. So there was a migration upwards into. I mean, Wallace Stegner's family being a good example. They lived in East End, Saskatchewan. So that was quite usual to me to think about people moving across that border. Yeah. It's also the case that the southernmost part of Canada is the northernmost part of the United States. So just almost in demographic and sociological terms, they're different in that way. The northern tier of the United States, the northern Dakotas, the northern Minnesota is kind of a foreign and wild frontier place. Whereas for Canadians, it's less so. It's warmer, for one thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said something just now describing the deciding to have the parents rob the bank, that you backloaded that.
Yes.
And you said something last night, I can't remember if it was to the small group you were speaking to or it was to me, but you said, it takes me 3 years to write my first sentence.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I'm a guy who is always writing stuff down, and I'm keeping a little notebook, which I have here in my hand. And over the course of, over the course of 3 years, if I'm thinking to myself, I want to write a novel about this kid crossing this border, I just go on writing down everything I think about it. And I have a sort of an old fear of not finishing something that I start, because when being dyslexic and I was a kid, I didn't finish a lot of things that I started. And so when I started trying to be a novelist in 1968, I thought, you have to finish everything you start. So I just accumulate any random piece of material that seems apposite to what I'm sort of dimly understanding my project, my book to be, which is not a book then. And at a certain point, I begin to think, well, you're putting off writing by accumulating material. So then I get all of this accumulated material and I put it into a big notebook and I divide it up into sections. A section for one character, a section for another character, a section for Saskatchewan, a section for Great Falls, Montana. And then I just study it the way you'd study for a bar exam. And from the product of that study, I try to write one good early sentence, the first sentence in the book. Because, there's a moment in writing a story or writing an essay or writing a novel in which everything is completely possible for you. The world, sometimes that daunts people and they don't get very far. But the first time you write a sentence, what was once immense and just copiously possible is not that way anymore. And so when I write that sentence, I want to think it's the right sentence because I want it to lead me to where I want the book to, and because my choices are decidedly more limited than they were an hour before.
You mentioned your dyslexia, among many things, because you've been a railroad worker, you've been a teacher, you've been a U.S. Marine.
Briefly. I didn't get anywhere.
And you've been a sports writer, briefly, and you were dyslexic. How does the dyslexia fit into, you would think you would have stuck with the railroad, perhaps?
Yes.
Or you would have perhaps stuck with any other thing, the U.S. Marines.
Yes.
But so, how did that marry your writing career?
Well, it makes me a very slow reader, but it makes me in the ponderous way that I do read, which is about as fast aloud as I can read silently. And I'm not, so to say, cripplingly dyslexic. I'm sort of a little bit worse than mildly dyslexic. It makes me pore over sentences. And that's what writers do. We pore over sentences. And it makes all of those non-cognitive qualities of language, which is to say what words look like, how many syllables they have, how many glottals and fricatives and schwa e's and long a's, very palpable to me. So when I'm writing sentences, I'm very much in touch with sentences' non-cognitive qualities as well as their cognitive qualities. And so, it's making a virtue of a vice. There's no doubt about that. But I wasn't probably going to be nearly as good at anything else. And Christina loved the idea. The first thing we ever said to each other was just before we were getting married in 1968. She said to me, as a young bride should say to her husband-to-be, "What do you think you're going to do with yourself after we get married?" And I said, "Sweetheart," I think I'm going to try to be a writer. And she said, "Oh, good." She said, "What a good idea." She said, "I'll get a job and have a career, and you stay home and write." And I thought, well, that's a good deal there. So that's sort of what we've done ever since.
It worked out.
It's working out.
I want to encourage you to come forward to the mics that are here, right in the front, to ask your questions of Richard. I'm going to ask one more question because you got into it, and this really interests me. the language aspect.
Yes.
It seems to me that you write almost millimetrically, certainly metrically, because there's a kind of poetry to your sentences. What is your attitude about putting together a sentence and and the language aspect of what you do?
Well, my attitude is that readers read everything they read one word at a time. And I want to authorize that word, and I want to authorize the experience that that word conjures. So there is that. I also read everything aloud. Sometimes I read whole novels to Christina aloud, which takes about 6 weeks. And in the process of doing that, I get to hear every break. I get to hear how many syllables every word has. And that's quite useful when you're trying to bring the reader to do something that the reader may not want to do, may have some resistance. I mean, I believe, I guess it's from being a dyslexic, I sort of believe every reader is looking for some reason to quit reading. So my goal is to try to counteract that urge to quit reading, and I do that when I steward all of the words, and so it's probably just that. The only problem is that when you write for your own voice, and we all have many voices. We don't have just one voice. When you write for your own voice, sometimes certain kinds of complexities in a sentence which would not be bothersome to a reader reading silently. Think about reading Henry James, for instance. Sometimes some of the complexities in a sentence can be hazarded a little bit in reading for your own voice, because you're trying to make things maybe simpler than they need to be. So I have to work hard against, when I come up upon a sentence which is a little grisly, which is a little dense, I try to turn loose of the voice, my reading voice, my speaking voice, and let the sentences be what they are, so that I can make it be as complex as I can. I mean, I want to make, in writing novels, the complexest of human experience accessible. Not easy, not simple, but accessible to a reader.
Well, you succeed.
Well, I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Let's have the first question, please.
Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Hello. I love hearing the stories of your life,
Yes.
and wondered if you could tell the story about when Alice Hoffman critiqued your book.
No, I don't want to tell that story. This is the wrong presidency for that story.
Thank you.
I don't mean to be preemptive about that story. That's a long time ago now, and best left in the dirt.
Was that the bad boy or the good boy in you?
Well, it was actually the bad boy and my wife.
Thank you for the question. Next one. Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Let me go over here first, please.
Good morning.
Good morning. As an aspiring writer myself, I just wanted to know, you mentioned something about writing happy stories. Do you think, since happiness and sadness tend to be different sides of the same coin, do you think it's
Thank you
possible?
very much for saying that, because you're
to write an
exactly
interesting
right.
story about that?
And no, just say that again. I was talking over you, and I didn't hear what you importantly said.
Do you think it's possible to write an interesting story about that?
Well, I mean, I think I have done it. There's a great line of Henry James, which is in his preface to What Maisie Knew. At the end of Henry James's life, about 1903, he went back through all of his novels and revised all of them. He didn't like them very much, and he wrote prefaces to all of them. And one of the prefaces is to one of his little short novellas called What Maisie Knew. And in that preface, he says, "There are no themes so human as those that reflect out of the confusion of life the relationship between bliss and bale, between the things that help and the things that hurt." So I'm always trying to get the things that help and the things that hurt into the same book, but always in a way that I think will, for the reader's experience, be redemptive. I mean, it may not be, you know, eat an ice cream cone kind of happy. It may not be Christmas morning kind of happy. But one of the things that a novel can do for the reader is to reimagine what happy is, not just receive it out of history or receive it out of convention, but make it up anew. And if you can say to yourself as a young novelist, what I'm doing here is I'm making up what happy is, then I think you're probably doing something that the reader has use for.
Thank you very much. You're a brilliant man.
Well, thank you for your question.
Wonderful question. Over here, please. Yes. Yes, let's give him a hand. Wonderful question. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for taking my question.
Yes, ma'am.
I was reading a book written by one of our former presidents, United States presidents.
Yes.
And inside the book, he indicated that writing was a form of therapy. So I just wanted to ask you the same question. Do you look at writing as a form of therapy when you write?
I do not. It may actually, well, first of all, I don't think I need therapy. But it may, and I may be wrong about that, and it may in fact serve a kind of therapeutic purpose for me. But if it does, it does it in such a ham-handed way. It would only be therapeutic for me if it is that therapy is giving me something to do. It isn't therapy because it's cathartic. It isn't therapy because it's solving some problem, some neurotic problem that I have and can't solve any other way. And I think in a way, for me at least, and no disparagement to the people for whom it is therapy, I think that's not a good enough reason to write a novel for it to be therapy for me. I don't want it to be therapy for you. I wanted to expose you to something that you couldn't ever be exposed to but through the pages of my book safely and you know, always with the option of closing the book if you want to. So no, it's not therapy for me. Once in my life, I thought maybe I should go to a therapist, and I only lasted a couple of visits. And I learned something when I went to the therapist. And if there are any therapists in the audience, listen up. The woman said to me, she said, "I can't deal with you, Mr. Ford." She said, "You have too many words." And so I thought, well, there we go, okay? I don't need therapy. I have words.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that question. No, I think that was a really good question.
Yes,
because
indeed. I'm glad that, yes.
Sometimes you figure out what you're thinking as you're writing.
Right.
So
It's just, I'm never trying much to write about myself. I'm not. You learn when you write a novel really only one important thing, for me anyway, not speaking for my colleagues. I learn what I'm capable of, both good and bad. I don't think that's therapeutic.
Pretty wonderful that a president was thinking of writing to sort of get therapy, don't you?
Think it's going to happen again?
Over here. Over here. Over here, please.
I was wondering how you knew when you were going to become a writer. I mean, an artist shows evidence of being an artist when they're young, as they're growing up. And did you have thoughts of writing as a young person, or did you just evolve into a writer, or how did that happen?
You know, the trajectory of my course to being a novelist is so pedestrian. It's so backing into everything. It's so much looking at a wall that was basically blank and seeing a little window open up in it. I mean, I went to, Christina and I both went to Michigan State, which is where we met, and I was a pretty good student. We were both pretty good students, and I took a creative writing course because the rest of my studies were so rigorous. And so I thought that the creative writing course that I would take would just be a kind of a lagniappe, as we say in New Orleans. It would just be a sort of a little free episode, you know, of the week. It would be easy. I could sit in my dorm room and sort of scribble away stuff, and I did that. And one of my teachers said to me one time, he said, you know, Ford, he said, you could probably do this. He said, you're never going to make a living at it. He said, but you could probably do it. And so I thought, well, I sort of tucked that away back in the back of my mind and went on to law school and went on to the other things that I failed at doing. And then when I finally failed at doing them, I looked around and there was just this left. There was one thing I liked to read. There was just this one thing that I hadn't failed at yet. And Christina thought it was a good idea. So I sort of thought, you know, give it a whack. And I mean, I wish I could say, you know, that my father secretly read Tolstoy or that I'd gone to Harvard. None of those things was true. But in a way, I don't think that's so bad because I have a sensibility which is attuned to people's lives at ground level, because I felt like my life was being lived at ground level. I wasn't aspirant particularly. I was just doing what I could do, and because I liked to read, as many of my young colleagues said last night, because I liked to read, whatever there was about life that bothered me, that made me feel inadequate to life, reading was always providing an extra beat to life that made me think there's something more, there's something more, there's something more. It was that, really.
Good thing you were good at that last thing.
Yeah.
Wonderful question. Thank you. One last question, I'm afraid, over here.
Yes, ma'am.
I found it interesting that you read novels out loud.
Yes.
And I know that there's writings that are actually written to be heard rather than read.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you saw your work that way, that it's better when it's heard than read.
Oh, God, I hope not. You know, no. I sometimes think that I have to read every book to every reader to get them all the way through it. But I really want those books to be read silently in the sanctity and quiet and serenity of someone's home who never will know me and whom I will never know. Just the most standard way about going about writing books. I read them aloud to try to exercise authority over every gesture that they contain. But then I want to hand them off to the reader and have the reader read them just the way I read books by people whom I don't know.
Can I ask one more?
Please, go ahead.
I'm very encouraged, you being dyslexic,
Yep.
and I raised a dyslexic child, and very hard to get them to read. And how
Yes.
can we encourage more dyslexics to read?
Read to them, read to them, read to them. Do that.
And can we emphasize auditory books more than reading, that you read a book and it should be the same as listening to it?
You may be asking the wrong boy about that. I've never listened to a book on tape. I want to read it in my hands. Or I don't read Kindles because I'm not handy with things like that. But I mean, it's okay. It's the same words. But I think auditory books might work. It just wouldn't work for me. I don't have the patience to sit someplace in the car or in the living room or in the bedroom or someplace and listen to something happening to me like that. There's something about reading books that's interactive, that you get to exercise authority. So whether you stop, whether you go on, no matter what you do.
Thank you. And for middle school teachers.
Or teachers in general.
Or teachers in general.
Do you have advice?
Do you have advice?
For students.
For
No. Just say, no, I can't. No, you say it.
So, yeah.
Okay, sorry, thank you. I'm a middle school teacher.
Yes,
for
ma'am, and
DC Public
congratulations.
Schools.
Thank you.
If you were to give one sentence of advice to students who have dyslexia or reading struggles, what would you say to children right now in an age of Instagram and Snapchat when it's easier to not read?
You know, I'm very much involved with this wonderful institution in Washington called the Lab School. The Lab School is a great institution. And they think at the Lab School that children have learning differences. They don't have learning disabilities. They don't have learning problems. They have learning differences. And if I could say one thing that you would say to your children who are dyslexic, it is, there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just learning differently from how others are learning, and they will learn just as much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think we know why one critic, many critics, but one critic I'm quoting, who said that Richard Ford is a master storyteller of the American canon. And another critic said, we should be deeply grateful for Richard Ford. And I think you will join me in saying thank you, Richard, for all your wonderful work.
Thank you.